thanking God. Once again, let's call Jeremiah 23 cliche. Convicting myself when I say it because cliches can be hard to avoid. However, they can be super confusing in Christianity, especially when we use them to replace things that God has literally said, especially things he has called or commanded us to do. But they're going to be a thing in this chapter that starts out in verses 1 through 4, issuing a woe to the shepherds of Judah who destroy and scatter the flock instead of gathering, leading, and I guess we could say protecting the flock, as that section of verses will go on to say he will tend to them, meaning God will tend to the shepherds who have not been tending to the flock. Then he will gather the remnant and provide them new shepherds who will lead them in productivity. Verses 5 through 8 pointing forward to the good shepherd. Seeming to talk about the Christ, it's literally going to talk about the righteous branch, a king to deal wisely in justice and righteousness for God's name's sake. Judah will be saved and Israel will be secure. The people will be gathered to their own land as opposed to the dispersion that he is promising is on deck, as verses 9 through 15 say regarding the prophets. I think it's saying his heart is broken. The land is filled with adulterers and all kinds of folly, or really foulness, as the prophet and priest, even in his own house, are leading the people astray. Therefore, he is going to deal with them as Samaria has prophesied by Baal and Jerusalem has prophesied by lies, strengthening the hand of the wicked as opposed to the righteous, leading to what I would call a pandemic in Judah, the spread of godlessness, once again leaving them little better, if any better, than Sodom and Gomorrah. Verses 16 through 18 going on to say, do not listen to them, that being the prophets. I think at this point they are once again strengthening the wicked, preaching peace to those who actually need to turn because they are headed for God's condemnation. Verses 19 through 20 saying, but behold, the storm of the Lord is approaching. Verses 21 through 22 saying, if they would have actually stood in the council of his presence, they would have been able to speak truth to the people, but they refused. Verses 23 through 25 going on to say, can you hide your ways from God? As if he does not see the fact that they are prophesying from their own hearts, saying, how long, in verses 26 through 29, will they prophesy from dreams that do not come from God, as opposed to clinging to his word? Verses 30 through 32 saying he is against those who in Judah steal his words from one another, meaning the prophets stealing their word from another prophet as opposed to getting a direct word from the Lord, who are telling of lying dreams and recklessly leading the people astray. Verses 33 through 40 talking about the cliche, thus the title, the burden of the Lord, seeming to be the phrase that they have grown accustomed to introducing their prophecies with, understanding that he's going to say the burden of the Lord is actually you or them, those who are using that cliche to introduce their own prophecies. He is going to say instead, replace that phrase with, what has the Lord spoken? Be specific, I guess, for lack of a better term, as verse 36 in particular in that last section, once again, verses 33 through 40, is going to say the burden is every man's own word. Reminding me of how these cycles, unbroken, roll back around through each generation as trends, understanding that the book of Judges, as we mentioned from time to time, ends with a statement that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Super similar to what we see at the end of the era of the kings, as God is about to once again remind them that he is taking them off into captivity because they're all making up, as we sometimes say, their own narrative about who God is and what he wants. And understanding that this is not the first time we have talked about narratives replacing God's word, the nuance that chapter 23 seems to add is the way that holy sounding cliches are used to sell the spin. Similar to the way in which we have mentioned before that name dropping can be used to add credibility to a statement that is otherwise suspect. And understanding that we live in a time that has no shortage of name-dropping cliches or spin, it is less and less safe or more and more dangerous to simply be a passive consumer of God's word above all else. So in a time where we can't even passively consume news in a safe way or in a reliable way, it's probably even more important for us to revive the concept that Paul talked about in the book of Acts of being a Berean, diligently seeking for ourselves the truth behind even the best teaching, but especially being diligent in seeking the truth behind the cliches.